Something unusual happened in the quiet corridors of international politics. No explosions, no scandals, no broken treaties, just an envelope. It traveled across oceans dressed in ceremony and apology, carrying a number that could transform a nation: $600 million. The world called it a reconciliation fund, a gesture of healing meant to bridge the Caribbean and Africa. It was supposed to be history wrapped in goodwill. When the message arrived in Burkina Faso, its weight was felt before it was even opened. For weeks, the plan had been circulating quietly. Through diplomatic channels, Jamaica was preparing a major act of symbolic generosity, an apology for the shared wounds of history packaged as opportunity. But when the proposal finally reached Captain Ibrahim Traoré, something unexpected happened. The moment that should have marked unity turned into silence, a silence that unsettled every government watching. He reviewed the document carefully, and the more he understood it, the clearer the tension became. Behind the noble language of reconciliation were pages of conditions, timelines, and expectations, the familiar fine print of diplomacy that often converts good intentions into quiet control. What was meant to look like partnership began to resemble purchase. Within hours, the world learned that the $600 million gesture had been turned on. There was no dramatic speech, no angry declaration, just a decision, deliberate, firm, and final. And that decision broke the rhythm of global diplomacy. News outlets called it shocking. Analysts debated the logic. How could a small, developing country refuse such wealth? But to those who had followed Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, the meaning was unmistakable. It wasn't about the money. It was about the message. In a world that tries to price dignity, he chose to prove that dignity still has no price tag. That act, calm, almost silent, became louder than any headline. It reminded the world that the real battle in modern politics isn't fought over resources, but over principles. For a brief moment, one leader's refusal made the entire system pause and question itself. And so the story begins, not with an offer, but with a rejection that would ripple from the heart of West Africa to the Caribbean, shaking the comfortable habits of diplomacy. It would spark debates, protests, and perhaps even a movement. Because sometimes history doesn't move when people accept what is offered, it moves when someone dares to say no. The plan began in distant boardrooms surrounded by advisors and polished intentions. Jamaica's leadership wanted to do something unprecedented, a financial gesture that would acknowledge centuries of shared suffering between the Caribbean and Africa. They called it a reconciliation fund, $600 million set aside as both apology and opportunity. To the world, it sounded like progress, a rare act of moral courage dressed in diplomacy. Months of preparation followed. Speeches were written, press statements rehearsed. It was to be a ceremony of healing, a bridge across the Atlantic that would allow Jamaica to step forward as a nation unafraid to face its past. Yet, as with many acts of global theater, the beauty of the stage concealed a different kind of script. Behind the language of partnership were terms that defined control. The fund came with conditions reports to file deadlines to meet public endorsements to make. It asked the recipient to not only accept the money, but also the narrative that came with it. To the donors, these clauses were ordinary. To the receiver, they carried a quiet weight. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, officials received the proposal with the courtesy expected of diplomacy. But beneath that courtesy, questions lingered. Where would the money truly go? Who would manage it? Would it strengthen communities or circle back to the same institutions already accused of corruption? The document itself promised reform, but between its lines was a subtler promise that the one who pays decides what progress looks like. For a leader like Ibrahim Traoré, whose vision of sovereignty had always been rooted in independence. This was not reconciliation. It was repetition, the same pattern he had seen in decades of foreign aid that claimed to lift nations while quietly keeping them dependent. To him, this offer was not simply generous. It was familiar. It looked like every deal dressed as friendship, every investment that arrived with invisible strings. And familiarity was the warning. For a nation still rebuilding its sense of self, accepting such a fund would mean reopening the door to the same dependency he had spent years closing. The world expected celebration. What it received instead was stillness. No press release, no public praise, just a decision that slipped through the cracks of protocol and landed like a tremor in the halls of diplomacy. The $600 million offer was quietly returned, its envelope intact, its message unanswered. When the news broke, reactions were instant. In Kingston, the shock was almost physical. Government officials who had prepared for applause suddenly faced questions. Was this generosity misunderstood, or had they misunderstood generosity itself? In regional circles, the decision was labeled reckless. Economists called it idealistic. But within Burkina Faso, something deeper stirred a quiet pride that a small nation had chosen principle over prestige. The refusal sent ripples far beyond the two countries involved. Commentators began to speak of a new moral language emerging from Africa, one that measured wealth not by what could be gained, but by what could be refused. The same world that often portrayed the continent as dependent was now forced to watch as one of its nations said no and meant it. In a single moment, a gesture meant to display unity became a mirror that reflected imbalance. The offer had been designed to heal old wounds. Instead, it exposed the habits that kept those wounds open. It reminded everyone that in international relations, even apologies can have conditions. That was the irony no one expected. An act meant to bring two nations closer had instead pulled back the curtain on how easily goodwill becomes transaction. And in choosing not to participate, Ibrahim Traoré did something quietly revolutionary. He reminded the world that respect is not a commodity. The event that was meant to celebrate connection had become a lesson in separation. But out of that refusal, something new was beginning to form, a conversation that would stretch across continents and generations. Because when a man says no to money, the world always listens. What began as a quiet act of defiance soon escaped the walls of diplomacy. Within a day, news of the refusal crossed borders, carried by journalists, analysts, and voices online. By the time the sun rose over the Atlantic, what had been a confidential exchange between two governments had become a global discussion. The story of a small African nation turning down $600 million was too extraordinary to stay contained. In Kingston, disbelief turned to debate. Political commentators questioned the wisdom of the rejection, while others wondered what hidden truths had pushed Burkina Faso to walk away. The Jamaican government, once preparing for a moment of triumph, now found itself defending intentions it had believed were pure. Opposition leaders began to ask uncomfortable questions. Was this fund truly an act of moral courage? Or had it been a carefully staged performance to win favor at home and abroad? But while Jamaica struggled with embarrassment, something different was happening across the ocean. In the heart of Africa, the story struck a deeper chord. It was not seen as defiance, it was seen as clarity. For many, Ibrahim Traoré had voiced what they had long felt but rarely heard in the language of power, that real independence demands the ability to refuse. Across university campuses and radio stations, people began to talk about the meaning of dignity in modern politics. Young Africans who had grown up hearing that development only comes from foreign partnerships started to question that belief. They saw in Traoré's act not arrogance, but a rare kind of courage, the willingness to lose wealth in order to preserve worth. In Jamaica, too, the story refused to fade. Students gathered in downtown squares holding discussions that grew into demonstrations. They spoke not against their government, but against a mindset, the idea that apologies tied to money could ever repair injustice. The movement spread fast, carried by a generation hungry for sincerity. Accountability became the new anthem. Soon, in cities like Accra, Nairobi, and Kigali, murals began to appear painted by young artists who had only seen African leaders portrayed as followers. Now they painted a different image, a leader who said no, not to insult the world, but to remind it of its own conscience. The energy was electric but disciplined, fueled not by anger, but by recognition. Across both continents, people began to speak of a new awakening, one not born from protest, but from perspective. The refusal of a single check had become a mirror reflecting how much the world had learned to equate generosity with control. In conversations on screens in classrooms, the same question surfaced again and again. What does it mean to rebuild trust? If every gesture comes with a receipt, Western media tried to simplify the story. They called the protests emotional, the debates reactionary. But those labels only proved how little they understood. What was happening was not rebellion. It was reclamation. For the first time in a long while, communities across Africa and the Caribbean were defining morality on their own terms. Everywhere the tone shifted from defense to pride. Ibrahim Traoré's quiet decision had become something larger than politics. It became language, a new vocabulary for nations tired of apologizing for their dignity. For decades, the world had asked the Global South to be grateful. Now it was learning what it meant for the Global South to be principled. In the following weeks, what began as a small wave of conversations evolved into a continental rhythm. Youth groups organized seminars on ethical leadership. Journalists began tracing how foreign aid had shaped public perception for generations. Even in the diaspora, from London to New York, Black communities found a renewed sense of unity, seeing in this moment not a single man's defiance, but a collective rediscovery of self-respect. And so, from a single decision in Ouagadougou, a movement was born, one that carried no slogans of revenge or hatred, only a shared desire for honesty in how nations treat one another. It was as if the act of saying no had unlocked a buried truth, that morality could be more powerful than money, and that silence, when grounded in integrity, could speak louder than every speech combined. The world was watching. Governments began to wonder whether this was an isolated act or the beginning of a shift too big to contain. But even they knew something had changed. A single refusal had redrawn the emotional map of diplomacy. Long after the first headlines faded, the echo of that refusal continued to travel. What began as a single act of integrity was slowly turning into a framework, a way of thinking that blended politics with conscience. Across ministries, universities, and community halls, people began referring to it simply as a doctrine, the belief that sovereignty must be measured not by wealth or alliances, but by the honesty of a nation's choices. In Burkina Faso, that belief was taking shape in quiet but visible ways. Economic reforms began to favor self-funded projects. National industries were pushed to rely on local talent instead of foreign consultants. It wasn't a rejection of cooperation, it was a demand that cooperation start from equality, not dependency. Traoré's government promoted the idea that dignity could function as a national resource, one that produced stability more valuable than any grant. Across the Caribbean, echoes of the same logic surfaced. In Jamaica, the fund once described as a milestone had become a mirror. Public discussions turned inward. Civil groups started auditing how international money moved through their ministries. Economists debated whether moral independence could coexist with economic growth. A new generation of citizens began to view accountability not as punishment, but as proof of maturity. This quiet transformation wasn't led by slogans or fiery speeches. It grew through recognition, a collective understanding that the old way of doing politics had exhausted itself. For decades, governments had treated aid as both a safety net and a shield. Now people were asking whether that safety had slowly turned into captivity. By mid-year, the conversation had reached the African Union. In regional summits, delegates spoke of a new vocabulary of partnership, one grounded in transparency and self-respect. The tone was different, less apologetic, more deliberate. The continent that had long been portrayed as waiting for direction was now defining its own compass. The movement also reshaped the idea of leadership itself. To many observers, Traoré represented a rare paradox, an authority built not on fear or fortune, but on restraint. His refusal to chase validation became its own form of credibility. Foreign investors expecting turbulence instead found steadiness. Citizens expecting hardship found renewed trust. In an unexpected turn, moral independence began to generate economic confidence. Meanwhile, in classrooms and community centers, from Dakar to Bridgetown, the conversation deepened. Teachers used the story as a case study in civic education. Students discussed how integrity could act as policy, not philosophy. The phrase "dignity over dollars" began appearing on posters and in essays not as propaganda, but as aspiration. Western analysts watched with a mixture of admiration and unease. Many admitted that the idea of ethical sovereignty, if it spread, could change the balance of global influence. It questioned the foundation of the aid industry, the belief that generosity guarantees authority. And though governments seldom said it aloud, they recognized the challenge: when a nation refuses to be bought, the market of influence collapses. Back in Ouagadougou, the mood was sober but proud. There was no triumphalism, only focus. People understood that independence demanded endurance. Refusing money was the easy part. Building without it was the real test. Yet, beneath the uncertainty, there was a calm conviction that something irreversible had begun. The world had always associated progress with accumulation, with higher budgets, larger projects, grander promises. But now, a different definition was emerging: progress as integrity, prosperity as consequence, not compromise. By the end of the year, journalists no longer spoke of a rejection. They spoke of a reset. The rejection had evolved into a doctrine, the Traoré doctrine, as they began to call it, built on 3 pillars that ordinary citizens could understand without reading a single policy paper: self-reliance, accountability, and moral capital. Across continents, people were starting to live by that code in small, practical ways. Entrepreneurs prioritized local production. Journalists pursued transparency over access. Citizens demanded that governments explain not only how money was spent, but why it was accepted in the first place. It was the rebirth of accountability, not imposed from above, but chosen from within. And quietly, through the steady rhythm of these changes, the world began to see something that statistics could never capture: a shift in moral gravity. For the first time in a long while, the measure of a nation's strength was no longer how much it could receive, but how much temptation it could resist. Across the ocean, in offices filled with policy papers and glowing screens, analysts in Washington watched the story unfold with a mix of confusion and fascination. It was not the size of the money that caught their attention, but the simplicity of the act. A poor nation had declined an offer that most governments would have accepted without question. That kind of moral decision did not fit easily into the formulas of diplomacy. In think tanks and newsrooms, the conversation began cautiously. Some described Ibrahim Traoré's move as symbolic, others called it naive. But beneath the professional language there was an unspoken discomfort. The event had exposed a truth that few wished to face if nations without power could act with integrity. What excuse remained for those who had every advantage? American commentators debated the meaning of the refusal. Was it defiance? Or was it leadership? For decades, the United States had defined progress abroad through aid alliances and influence. Yet here was a leader rejecting the very currency of that system, refusing assistance, not because of arrogance, but because he saw it as a tool of control. The gesture forced a rare kind of reflection in a country that had long equated generosity with virtue. In universities and editorial pages, questions started to appear. Could America, with all its power, still recognize the difference between helping and managing? Between partnership and ownership? The image of Traoré returning the offer became a quiet metaphor for something larger. A mirror held up to the Western conscience. It revealed how easily moral authority can turn into habit, and how habit left unchallenged becomes dependence of another kind. Meanwhile, international observers began noticing a subtle shift. Across the global south, diplomats were quoting the Burkina Faso example in private meetings. Some even used it as leverage, pushing back against conditions attached to Western funding. It wasn't rebellion, it was recalibration. The balance of moral gravity was changing, and the centers of power could feel it. In the corridors of American diplomacy, the response was mixed. Publicly, there were calls for understanding and continued dialogue. Privately, there was unease. The refusal had proven something that years of aid statistics could not, that influence loses value when integrity becomes contagious. For ordinary Americans watching from afar, the story resonated differently. Older generations who had lived through decades of promises about democracy and justice saw in Traoré's stance a reminder of what those words once meant before they became slogans. It wasn't about agreeing with him politically. It was about recognizing courage that felt strangely familiar. The courage of standing alone for what is right, even when the world calls it foolish. By the time the debate settled, the question lingered like a quiet echo. What happens when the world's poorest nation teaches the richest ones a lesson about values? For America, that was not a criticism. It was a mirror, and sometimes a reflection is the hardest truth to face. When the noise of debate faded and the headlines moved on, one truth remained. A single act, quiet, deliberate, and almost invisible in its simplicity, had changed how the world understood strength. In rejecting the $600 million offer, Ibrahim Traoré had not just refused money. He had refused the idea that justice can be bought, that dignity is a transaction, that forgiveness can carry a price tag. For many, that moment felt like the rebirth of something long lost in global politics, moral clarity. It reminded people everywhere that leadership is not measured by what one accepts, but by what one can resist. In that sense, Traoré's decision was more than a gesture of defiance. It was a lesson in the language of integrity. In the months that followed, the phrase, Burkina Faso's stand, began to appear in unexpected places, in classrooms, in sermons, even in political speeches, half a world away. It became shorthand for an uncomfortable truth that progress without honesty is just theater. Nations that once lectured about ethics found themselves re-examining their own compromises, and those who had long felt voiceless discovered that saying no could be a form of self-definition. There was no parade, no victory celebration in Ouagadougou. Life went on quietly, as it always does when history shifts beneath the surface. But in the minds of millions, something had changed. The image of a leader refusing to sell his country's dignity became a symbol of modern courage, a reminder that moral wealth can outlast material aid. For older viewers who have seen decades of politics shaped by deals and donations, this story carries a familiar rhythm. It recalls the moments when conscience stood taller than convenience, when individuals against the odds chose to protect something unseen but sacred. Dignity is not loud. It does not demand applause. It endures quietly, shaping nations the way roots shape trees. As the world continues to chase growth, perhaps the greatest form of progress is restraint, the wisdom to pause, to question, to remember that every coin carries a choice. The story of Ibrahim Traoré is not about rejection. It is about restoration, the restoration of truth as a measure of value. And so the question now returns to us. If money can't buy freedom, why do we keep selling it? If justice can be purchased, was it ever justice at all? Please share this story if you believe that dignity still matters more than wealth. Subscribe if you believe that truth deserves to be heard before the headlines. Because sometimes the most powerful word in the world is the smallest one, no.